Hi there, Michelle here from McQuaid TV. We're helping you find ways to move from functioning to flourishing by putting the latest science to the real-world test. Today to help us, I'm very pleased to have back the wonderful Caroline Adams-Miller, who's a fellow Masters of Applied Positive Psychology graduate from the University of Pennsylvania and a well-known coach, author, speaker and educator in the fields of empowerment, grit, change, well-being and the science of goal accomplishment. Her book, Creating Your Best Life, was the first book to connect the science of happiness with the science of goal setting. And her next book, Authentic Grit, will discuss why this character strength is so important to a flourishing life, how to get it, and who has it. Caroline's often in the media and has appeared in many radio, television and magazine stories and has a TEDx talk on grit called The Moments That Make Champions. She was named the 2012 Good News Ambassador by the Good News Network and received the Mentoring Award from the George Washington University School of Business in 2013 for her decades of helping others to achieve their goals. She was one of the first happiness experts to join and advise Happify, the world's largest online community dedicated to assessing and amplifying well-being through evidence-based games and activities. Welcome, Caroline.
Hi, Michelle. Nice to talk to you.
It's so good to chat to you, and I'm so looking forward to this conversation because it seems lately everywhere I go, people are talking or writing about grit, and I think people are really attracted to this idea of grit. Sounds so solid and dependable, but exactly what is grit and why would we want it at work?
Okay, so it is an overused term, and I think it's become a little bit trite in the ways in which I see it in the sports section. So let's just step back. It's not resilience, although you need resilience to be a gritty person. So resilience is kind of the ordinary level of approaching grit. Grit, as defined by Angela Duckworth, is passion and perseverance in pursuit of long-term goals. So I started with that definition, and I have broadened it to include work on what I call authentic grit. And there are a number of different kinds of authentic grit, but if we start with Angela's definition, I think that's a place where we can branch off and talk about, well, why is it so misunderstood and why do we need it, especially now?
So let's do that. Why is it so misunderstood and why do we need it? I mean, I think most of us like the idea of passion and perseverance for long-term goals. We could go, yeah, I need some of that. We've all had those moments where we just want to quit, give up, good ideas that we've failed on. So why do we need this and how accessible is it to people?
Well, that's a great question, the accessibility of it. Let me start with why do we need it? We need it because we are in a situation, at least in the United States, if not in lots of other countries, where we are coming off a generation of parenting that really abdicated responsibility for cultivating self-regulation, for cultivating passion, for letting kids kind of suffer the consequences of their own actions. So in this country, it's called snowplow parenting or helicopter parenting or hyper-parenting, a lot of names for it, but it extended through the lifespan. And what we have are these millennials in the workplace, and so their lack of ability to see through to the end of goals, particularly hard goals, or to even set them, to have any kind of patience with the process. It's really missing. And now on college campuses, the things that happened decades ago, the free speech with the Vietnam War, that couldn't happen anymore. I mean, we have a bubble-wrapped generation of college students who cry foul and victimhood whenever there's a reading list that they disagree with, or that, God forbid, they hear a concept that they don't agree with. They have to retreat to safe spaces on campuses, including one at Brown University 2 years ago that was a room that had a loop of frolicking puppies on a video and coloring books and chocolate chip cookies. These are the future leaders of our country, and this is how they're growing up. So yes, we have to cultivate it. And the fallout from the self-esteem parenting movement, the hyper-parenting, the helicopter parenting, the lawyers litigating if playgrounds aren't safe enough, is everywhere. It's in sports. It's in the military. It's in entrepreneurship, which is down 9%. It is everywhere. And if we don't stop it and all play a role in it, we're going to have devastating consequences across the world, is what I believe.
I think that's so true, and I think, for many of us, we can definitely see that in those generations as well. But I know even, coaching some of the business leaders I do and working with some of the female leaders, they struggle with grit as well. And I'd like to think, our generation, we had the metal slides that had been in the sun all day in the playground that would burn your legs when you went down them. But I still think think, it's just become more acceptable to perhaps give up, to not always push through. I think so many of us struggle to be comfortably uncomfortable. And when I think about grit, and particularly when I'm in the midst of a big project and it's not going the way I want, or I'm striking more obstacles, or it's just taking too much energy, it's easy to just go, just quit, start something else instead. So I find even for older generations that stickability and our ability to be comfortably uncomfortable is often the way I think of it, is lacking. So is this just a millennial thing, or do you think this applies for us at other stages of life as well?
Well, it's particularly a millennial thing because it became okay to be good enough. And the trophies, it's called the partial reward extinction effect. That's what happens in the brain when kids get rewarded for doing nothing, and even adults get rewarded for doing nothing. So what it begins to prune off is the ability to be curious and explore. So over-rewarding makes people sit down, get fat, and stop trying. And so that's not just the millennials, but it's overwhelmingly the millennials. But of course, there are people, our peer group, who struggle with it too, but just not as many. I don't find myself needing to coach quite as many CEOs or leaders around this, but a lot of them do need to understand the seeds of how their behavior can be contagious when it comes to teaching others how to be gritty. And so it really starts at the top. And so if you're not at the senior leadership on board with this idea of what is grit and how do you cultivate it, I don't see how a workplace can set long-term goals and stick with it. So the American Bar Association in this country has a huge grit initiative because one of the studies that came out showed that the female lawyers with the highest amount of grit are the ones who make partner. Now, is making partner a good thing? Is it something that's going to make you happy? Possibly not. So I'm not going to argue that a lot of grit in the legal field is a winning trait, but it's something that we really need to think about if we're going to succeed in our goals at work.
So let's talk about that. Is this nature or nurture or an and? I mean, what are those kind of things that a CEO would need to do or senior leaders need to do if they're going to lead grit from the top?
Okay, so this is the burning question in the grit field, and I'm sure, although I haven't read Angela's book, that she addresses this. And there's a lot of controversy going on. There was a front page article in the New York Times just a few days ago about how San Francisco schools are teaching grit in the classroom, and teachers are being graded by whether or not their students are coming up gritty. And Angela resigned from that board and said, it's too early for this because we're still learning how to cultivate it. So her research has found that about half of the ability to be gritty is inborn. Some people are more impulsive. Some people are more optimistic. Some people are more resilient. That's the way it goes. However, the reason I'm most fascinated by this topic is because I had to cultivate grit in order to save my own life. So many decades ago, I think a lot of people are aware, I had an eating disorder called bulimia, and I literally had to fight my way back to life. And I did it before anybody knew how to get better. And I wouldn't call myself gritty before this. I would say I was talented or I was successful. I had the trappings of success in the right schools and so on. But what I didn't have was passion. And I don't think I really had perseverance for things that were really important and meaningful. And so saving my own life became my passion. I had to do it, or I was going to check out like so many other people. And so I developed grit. I see in hindsight, this is what the light bulb that went on at Penn, my gosh, I cultivated it. And if I did, I'll bet other people can too. So I started to dig into it. That's why I wrote about it in Creating Your Best Life. And I know that there are people I've interviewed who say they weren't particularly gritty until they gave birth to a child with special needs, for example. And one of the women I interviewed said, everyone needs a warrior, and I had to become a warrior for my son. I was reading about an entrepreneur the other day who said he had no passion for anything until he started his company and realized how much he wanted it to work. So there are qualities you have to cultivate in order to become gritty. We're still putting it all together to figure out exactly what and how those things are.
So based on what we've been finding so far, and I know of course your other big area of passion is around the science of goal setting, what do people do practically? If we need to be grittier at work, perhaps we're in the middle of a project at the moment and struggling to keep pushing through, or we're driving our own business and our passion and suddenly finding that the hardest thing is actually showing up every day and sticking with it, what can we practically start playing with based on what the science is learning so far, do you think?
Okay, so a few things. I had three ideas that I gave in my TEDx talk, and one of those was simply learning to say why not to yourself. And I find that so much of the ability to take risks starts in our head. And this comes straight out of sports psychology, where it's been found that the body quits only after the brain gives it permission to quit or begins to play with the idea of quitting. So what I found with the gritty people I've interviewed is they don't even go there. They don't even allow themselves to consider quitting. So some of this starts with your self-talk, and I would say take a look at what's going on in your head. What are the things that you do to give yourself permission to quit? So that's one thing. I think people also need to learn to play with the whole idea of being patient. We've become a very impatient culture, and people don't wait in line anymore. And one of the prescriptions I'm giving in the book is go wait in line somewhere, and don't check your smartphone. Just stand there, get through it, sit on hold. Listen to the voicemail messages that come in on your phone instead of just erasing them. There's so many interesting ways that it's been found that we've lost the ability to have any attention. So our attention span is 1 second less than a goldfish now. I mean, that's kind of startling. You have to learn how to talk to yourself. You have to learn to have a passion. Don't quit before, something becomes a passion of yours. Follow your interests. As Angela says, choose easy, work hard. Walk through those open doors, but stick with it. Too many parents give their children permission to quit things or to take the easy way out. So take a look at the people around you, the environment, the colleagues that you choose to spend time with. It is a contagious emotion. And so those are just a few of the places to start. But I find building teamwork is part of what gritty people do. They have patience. Another thing I find that they have, very interesting, is humility. They have humility. So I've been really looking at the research on humility. And what it is humility does not drive well-being. There's no evidence showing that you become happier from having humility. But what it does promote is self-regulation. And it does promote the idea of working with other people because it's not all about you. So that's why in my book I've come up with several different kinds of bad grit, and one of them is selfie grit. I mean, people who just look at me, I did hard things. It repels people. And then there's also faux grit, fake grit, or people who pretend to have done hard things. You have to have your radar out, for some of the ways in which it might look gritty, but it might not be. Make yourself understand what is true grit, what is I call authentic grit, and what is not. I think one of the things we were going to discuss today is just this whole idea of stupid grit. Grit, when you look at Angela's definition, passion and perseverance in pursuit of long-term goals, it doesn't really explain how you can overuse that and do harm to yourself and others. So the Wall Street Journal recently ran an article about too much grit in the workplace. Boy, grit is a bad thing. No, the overuse of anything good, as you know from your work with the VIA Institute, the overuse of strengths it can be bad. So when you overuse grit, I call it stupid grit, you drive forward to the detriment of yourself and others. And you can do tremendous physical harm to yourself when you look at things like summit fever in mountaineering. So those are just a few of the ways in which I'm conceptualizing grit.
And I love that you're talking to us about, well, here are some practical things you can do to improve it, but here are some smart ways to use it. I think like any of these tools in positive psychology that you and I get to play with, it's important they're not used as blunt instruments and that situation and desired outcomes matters. Context is king with many of these things. So, Caroline, where do you see the intersection of grit and goal setting, though? So, for you, given the background to which you've come to grit with so much research and practical advice and coaching for people on goal setting, what role do you think that plays in helping us to be gritty?
Okay, well, I think in order to be gritty, you have to set goals, but you can set goals and not be gritty. So it's not a direct match. So a lot of people set goals, but they don't necessarily follow through. You can have ambition, you can have goals, but if you always quit right before you get to the finish line, that's not grit. But if you're going to have grit, you need to have these long-term goals, these goals that are meaningful to you. In Japanese, the word is ikigai. What do I wake up for? What's my purpose? And so you have to have goals that become drivers in your life. That's what makes life worth getting up for. And that's the passion that we talk about. So you do need to understand how to set goals. And I have a chapter in my book on just the basics of goal setting because so many people don't know it, the science of goal setting. But then you have to be somebody who becomes a finisher. And I'll tell you why it matters so much is the more I did these interviews, the more I realized that it's grit that has changed the course of history. Grit changes the world. And there are no companies that make a dent in the world without these gritty long-term goals. And you need people to be able to see it through to the finish line, to be emotionally flexible, to be able to pivot and not have stupid grit. But when I looked at what has changed the world, what has changed history, I saw these pivotal people in these moments. Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson, so many other people. And when I looked at what was there, what was similar, what I found was they had these long-term goals, not short-term goals. They had these long-term goals, these goals that, filled them up and lit them up. And then what they did was they overcame challenges, not one, lots of them. But how did they overcome those challenges? They overcame them with self-regulation and dignity. I found dignity and humility right there. And that is what changed the world. You know why? It's because their dignity in the face of abuse. And, just think about the race riots that were here when Martin Luther King was doing his peaceful marches. What I found is that because of the self-regulation, they got followers. And those followers are what caused the course of history to change. So if you're going to live a meaningful life, if you're going to live a life that leaves behind a legacy you're proud of, you have to have grit. And another thing is, there's research called the no pain, no gain research. And all of us, whether we know it or not, we scan our days at the end of the day for what we did that was hard. And we may not know it, but if we had a day that was not out of our comfort zone somewhere, we code that day as mediocre. And you don't want to be mediocre. You know why? It's so easy to be mediocre. And you want to be uncomfortable. Being gritty doesn't mean being happy all the time. You have got to make your mark in your world somewhere. You don't have to win the Olympics, but you've got to go for the gold, because that is what will make your mark, and that's what will make you proud of yourself.
I think that's so true, and I do think we have this tendency to look for the easy life or the, just the purely happy life, and we underestimate the joy actually that stress and challenge, the learning and growth that discomfort brings. Caroline, you mentioned that, most of us don't actually know how to set goals, and I know you've got a wonderful workbook that's available for people if this is something they're struggling with. Can you tell us a little about the workbook so if people are wanting more help on, how do I set these meaningful goals, they know where to go?
So I've been teaching goal setting classes for many years because there's a science of goal setting, because I don't think enough people know that and have access to it. So I took my month-long online class and I turned it into a 100-page workbook that really walks you through every facet of goal setting. How do you set short-term goals? How do you set long-term goals? What is priming? What's self-regulation? How do you up your game in a variety of different contexts with people? What's contagion? So that workbook is only $7.99 in US dollars, but it is something you can use again and again and again. And so that's available on my website.
And I highly recommend it. So head over to carolinemiller.com and you can see the URL on your screen now. You'll be able to find the workbook there. You'll also be able to find a free chapter of Caroline's new book coming up, Authentic Grit, which Caroline, out around May, we think. Is that right, this year? Fantastic. I can't wait to read the full book. And Caroline, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. You do a fantastic job bringing so much news to the world.
Well, there's so much good news to bring. And thank you for watching us. And if you're looking for more tested, practical ways to move from functioning to flourishing at work, be sure to stop by michellemcquaid.com, leave your name and email address so you can hear all our news first. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching Shell McQuaid TV. Remember, you are good enough, so don't be afraid to let your strength shine. Until next time, take care.